Hey, Light and Life kids! Okay, we are continuing our story today, and this is where it gets a little sad. But remember, there is a happy ending. But today we're going to talk about some of the tough stuff that happened. A lot of hard things can happen in our lives, but we can remember that Jesus went through really hard times too, and he remembered to trust God, his Father, and he continued to do what was right even when it was hard. So today we're going to start in a story called A Dark Night in the Garden. Now this was after the Last Supper. Jesus and his disciples had taken that Passover meal together, and they walked outside, they sang their favorite worship song together, and they went to their favorite place. You remember? It was an Olive Garden, not the restaurant, but it was a garden, and olives grew there. So the wind was picking up now. It was night. The clouds were blowing across the moon, and it was shrouding the garden in darkness. Jesus asked his friends, "Stay awake with me?" And they said yes, and they waited under the olive trees, but they were tired and they soon fell asleep. Take a look at this. You see Jesus' disciples down there? They're sleeping. Jesus there in the back praying. So Jesus walked ahead alone in the dark. He needed to talk to his heavenly Father. Sometimes you need to talk to God, right? Sometimes nobody else seems to understand, and you really just need to get away and pray. He knew it was time for him to die. They had planned it a long time ago, he and his Father. Jesus was going to take on the punishment or the consequences for all the wrong things anyone had ever done or would ever do. "Papa, Father," Jesus cried, and he fell to the ground. "Is there any other way to get your children back, to heal their hearts, to get rid of this poison that we call sin?" But Jesus knew that there was no other way. All the poison of sin was going to have to go to his own heart. God was going to pour into Jesus all the sadness and brokenness from everybody else. He was going to pour all the sickness from everyone else into him too. God was going to have to blame his Son, give him the bad consequence for everything that had ever gone wrong. And it would crush Jesus. It would crush his heart, right? That's a lot to have on your shoulders. Everything bad that ever happened and ever would happen, to all be on one person. Well, Jesus was not just a person, though. He was God too, right? He is God. Now there was something else, something even harder. When people run away from God, they would lose God. That's what would happen because they ran away, right? So not being close to God was part of the punishment, is part of the punishment from sin. So Jesus was going to have to take that punishment too, being far from God. Jesus knew what that meant. He was going to lose his Father for a time. And Jesus knew that that would really break his heart. Sometimes we feel like we've been alone, but God is still always with us. What Jesus experienced there was really, truly being all alone. So that we can find community and so that we won't feel alone. That's why Jesus had to feel super, super alone, because now we can turn to Jesus and he forgives us of our sin, right? And now we don't have to be alone anymore. So whenever you feel alone, pray to God because he's with you. Jesus cried, but not just a regular cry, like the hardest cry you ever cried, and harder. He was like violent. He was crying so hard. Then he was quiet, like a little lamb that they had at Passover. Jesus said to God, "I trust you, Papa. Whatever you say, I will do." Jesus was going to experience the hardest thing that anyone could ever experience. He knew it was going to hurt. It and it was going to be sad and lonely, but it was for a time. But he didn't really want to do it. He wasn't excited going into it, but he wanted to do it because it would reconcile, bring us back to God. So he chose to obey God even when it was hard. Now you see here, Jesus and his disciples, and then some men with spears and swords and a fire. Let's find out what's going on. Suddenly through the trees, flashing of light off steel, into the quiet garden came whispers, muffled voices clanking metal, and the sounds of boots marching. Jesus stood up and woke up his friends, and he said, "Now it's time. Everything that was written about me, what God had been telling his people all through the long years, it's coming true now." Into the night, with burning torches and lanterns, with swords and clubs and armor, they came, an army of soldiers. Judas, you remember Judas? Judas led them straight to Jesus so they could arrest him. And Jesus was there waiting. Jesus knew this was going to happen. He knew it was part of God's plan. Now, Peter didn't know. He didn't understand what was happening. So he jumped up and he took a sword and he tried to defend Jesus, and he cut off the ear off of one of the guards. Now, Jesus, he stood up and he healed the guard. That's amazing. These guys are about to do terrible things to Jesus, and he healed the guard. "Peter," Jesus said, "that's not the right way." Peter didn't realize that there was no army, no matter how big, that could ever arrest Jesus unless Jesus let them. So then Jesus, who had never done anything wrong, all he had ever done was show people love, he was arrested as if he was a criminal or a bad guy. Jesus's friends, they were afraid, so they ran away and they hid. The guards marched Jesus off and took him to the leaders. The leaders put Jesus on trial and they asked him, "Are you the Son of God?" And Jesus said, "I am." They got mad. "Who do you think you are to call yourself God? We're going to say that you have to die for calling yourself the Son of God." So Jesus was trying to tell them, yes, I am really God. And for that, that's why they killed him. Now, only the Romans were allowed to kill prisoners. So the religious leaders, who were Israelites, not Romans, they made a plan. They said, we're going to tell the Romans that he wants to be our king. And then they'll crucify him because Caesar is the king of all of the places that Rome was over. But it was going to be all right because this was really God's plan. Jesus said, "It was for this reason that I was born into the world." At Christmas time, we don't normally think that baby Jesus is being born into the world so that he can go to the cross, but that's what he said. So the Roman soldiers said, "Oh, you think you're a king? So you'll need a crown and a robe." Guys, it gets kind of rough. They were not nice to Jesus at all. They gave Jesus a crown that was made out of pokey thorns, and they put a robe on him, and they pretended to bow down to him. They were making fun of him. They were saying mean things and making fun of him. They said, "Oh, your majesty." But then they whipped him. They whipped him and they spit on him. So they beat him up and made fun of him. They didn't understand that this was the Prince of Life, the King of heaven and earth, who had come to rescue them, even them. Now the soldiers made him a sign, and it said, "Our King," and they nailed it to the top of the cross. They walked up a hill outside the city, and Jesus carried the cross on his back. Jesus had never done anything wrong. He had never sinned. But they were going to kill him the way criminals were killed, or the way that bad guys at the time were killed. They nailed Jesus to the cross, and Jesus prayed, "Father, forgive them. They don't really understand what they're doing." And people shouted at him, "Oh, you say you came to rescue us? Well, you can't even rescue yourself." Now, they were wrong. Jesus could have very well saved himself. He could have sent in a legion of angels who could have flown down to his side and rescued him if he had called for them. But he didn't. Some people said, "If you're really the Son of God, then just climb down off that cross." Now, they were right. Jesus could have actually climbed down from that cross. He could have just said a word and it would have all just stopped. But just like when he healed the little girl, he calmed the storm, he fed 5,000 people, just like when he raised Lazarus from the dead. He could have done all of that with just a word, but Jesus stayed on the cross for us. They didn't understand that it was not necessarily the nails that held him there, but it was his love that kept him on the cross. And Jesus called out to God, "Papa, where are you? Don't leave me." Now, this is so hard. This was the first time, and thankfully the last time, that he would feel this way, apart from his Father. And then he didn't speak anymore. He didn't say anything else. It was just silence. God didn't answer. And he turned away from Jesus because that was the punishment for sin. Jesus cried. The face of the one who could wipe away every tear from every eye, his face had tears. Now, even though it was the middle of the day, it was actually super dreadfully dark. It just covered the whole world. It was so dark. The sun couldn't shine through. The earth trembled. There was a big earthquake. The mountain shook and rocks split in two. It seemed like the whole world was going to break, like creation itself was just going to tear apart. The full force of the storm of God's fierce anger at sin was coming down on his own Son instead of people. It was the only way that God could destroy sin and not destroy his children whose hearts were filled with sin, like us. Then, the last thing Jesus said, he shouted it in a loud voice. "It is finished." And it was. He had done it. Jesus had rescued the world. Now, he said, "Father, I give you my life." And then with a last breath, Jesus let himself die. Now the sky was filled with purple, orange, black, like a bruise. It was a strange day. And the people were kind of terrified. Jesus' friends gently carried his body and they laid him in a new tomb that was carved out of the rock. They wondered, how could Jesus die? Something must have gone wrong. What did all of this mean? They didn't understand it anymore. They knew that their hearts were breaking, and that sadness was all that they knew. And the leaders, the religious leaders, thought to themselves, good, that's the end of Jesus. Don't have to worry about that anymore. But just to be sure, because remember, Jesus had talked about coming back to life, they sent some soldiers, some strong soldiers, to guard the tomb. And they pushed this huge stone in front of the tomb door so that no one could get in and no one could get out. Now that leaves us kind of in a sad spot, but that's where our story today ends. But remember, it's not a sad story. So get ready for Easter, because that's when the joy comes back. That's when the happy story begins. All right. Well, today Remember that Jesus died for you, for me, for everyone who ever was. If we trust in him, he wants to forgive us and help us to do the right thing and to live in God's ways. Okay, Light and Life kids, I'll see you for Easter.